Soft piano music drifts in the background, the kind that feels like rain touching glass. Emma Carter stood alone in the elevator, clutching the strap of her worn leather bag. The doors slid shut behind her with a sigh, the kind that sounds like the start of something she couldn't name. It was her first day as an intern at Stonebridge Systems, a world built of glass, silence, and power. 59 floors above the noise of New York, she was about to meet a man whose name carried both admiration and fear, Alexander Stone, the billionaire CEO who never smiled. People said he was made of steel, that his heart beat only for profit and precision. But as the elevator rose, Emma felt something strange in the air, a weight, a pulse, a quiet storm waiting to break. Sometimes, life doesn't begin with fireworks. It begins with a single glance, one that lingers just a second too long. This is not just a story about power, or love, or desire. It's about what happens when two souls, both trapped in their own silence, find the courage to look at each other and see what no one else ever did. And on that quiet morning, as the elevator doors opened with a soft chime, destiny stepped in. The soft hum of the elevator filled the narrow space, a quiet, steady sound that almost matched the rhythm of Emma's heartbeat. She stood near the mirrored wall, clutching a slim folder against her chest, her reflection looking back at her with the same nervous half-smile. Outside, beyond the steel doors, New York pulsed with its usual chaos, taxis honking, people rushing, dreams colliding, but inside this elevator, time slowed. Emma Carter, 26, had dreamed of this day since her first semester at business school. Stonebridge Systems, the company everyone whispered about, the place where the future was being built, line by line, code by code. And now she was here, an intern among giants. The elevator stopped on the 32nd floor. The doors slid open with a soft chime, and a man stepped in. He was taller than she expected, dressed in a charcoal suit that fit like it had been sculpted for him. His presence shifted the air. Even the faint buzz of the lights seemed to quiet. Alexander Stone, she recognized him instantly. The CEO, the man whose photo had been on every article she'd studied, whose expression never changed, whose eyes never smiled. For a moment, she froze. Should she say something? A greeting? A simple good morning? But he didn't look her way. His gaze stayed fixed on the digital panel above, watching the numbers climb. 51, 52. Emma inhaled slowly. The air smelled faintly of cedar and something colder, the kind of scent that reminded her of winter mornings before sunrise. She lowered her eyes, pretending to read the notes in her folder, though the words blurred. Her throat was dry. The silence between them felt heavy, almost personal. A soft beep echoed. Someone from the 48th floor had called the elevator, but the doors never opened. Alexander reached forward and pressed the override key. The lights flickered slightly, and they kept rising. That was when Emma noticed it, his hand steady, long-fingered, but the knuckles were pale, tight, like he was holding something back, the kind of control that looked effortless until you realized how much strength it took to keep it. 57. The elevator slowed, humming lower now. He finally spoke, his voice deep but quiet. First day, Emma blinked, startled that he had spoken at all. Yes, sir. Emma Carter. I just started in the leadership development program. He turned slightly and studying her for the first time. His eyes were gray, the color of wet stone after rain. Stonebridge doesn't take interns often. I know, she said, trying to keep her voice steady. I'm honored. A faint nod. Then silence again. But not the same silence as before. This one carried something else: curiosity. Maybe, or recognition. She couldn't tell. The elevator stopped. The doors opened to a wide corridor of glass and light, lined with tall plants that looked too perfect to be real. Emma stepped aside quickly to let him pass, but he didn't move. You're on this floor, he asked. Yes. HR said to report to Mr. Davis on 59. He gestured toward the hallway. That's my office. Her pulse stumbled. She hadn't expected that. He waited, patient but unreadable, then started walking. She followed, the sound of her heels echoing softly behind him. The office space opened into a vast room with floor-to-ceiling windows. The city stretched endlessly below, the Hudson River gleaming like silver thread. Employees moved quietly, their eyes fixed on screens, their voices low. It felt less like an office and more like a cathedral built for logic. Alexander stopped by a desk near the corner. "You'll sit here today," he said. "Mr. Davis is out. I'll have you shadow the morning briefing." Emma nodded, tucking a stray strand of hair behind her ear. "Thank you, Mr. Stone." He gave no reply, just a brief glance that lingered half a second too long before he turned away. As he walked toward the conference room, Emma caught herself exhaling for the first time in minutes. Her knees felt light, almost trembling. She sat down, arranging her pens, her notepad, her water bottle, small rituals to steady herself. Around her, the city moved, indifferent and magnificent. She could still feel his presence, even after he'd gone, like heat that lingers after a candle is blown out. From her desk, she could see the glass-walled conference room where he stood now, talking to a group of executives. His posture was perfect, his gestures minimal, every movement measured, deliberate. People leaned in when he spoke, like gravity itself bent toward him. Yet there was something else. A distance, as if he existed behind invisible glass, untouchable even in a room full of people. Emma found herself wondering what it cost a person to build walls that high and what it might take to look over them. Coffee? A voice broke her thoughts. It was Lauren from HR, smiling kindly, holding 2 cups. "You look like you could use one." "Thank you," Emma said, taking it gratefully. "Is he always like that?" Lauren followed her gaze. "Alexander. He's disciplined, brilliant, but not easy. Most people don't last long working under him." Why Lauren hesitated, lowering her voice. "He doesn't let people in, not even his board. Some say it's because of his father, the founder. Others say he's just built that way." She shrugged. "You'll see." Emma watched through the glass as Alexander dismissed the room with a single nod. He stayed back alone for a moment, looking out at the skyline. For the briefest instant, his reflection in the window looked tired. Not cold, not powerful, just tired. Then he straightened, and the mask returned. Lauren whispered, "He never looks happy." "Does he?" Emma didn't answer. She was still staring at that faint reflection, the one that had looked almost human. Later that morning, as she gathered files from the printer, the elevator door opened again. Alexander stepped out, phone pressed to his ear, voice low but sharp. She heard fragments. No delays, deliverables, no excuses. Then silence, followed by a sigh that almost didn't belong to him. Their eyes met for the second time that day, and this time, he didn't look away. It lasted only a heartbeat, but in that small space of silence, Emma felt something shift. Not in the air, not in the building, inside her. A thought crossed her mind, quiet, uninvited. Maybe the man everyone calls cold isn't cold at all. Maybe he's just freezing in a place no one has dared to reach. She didn't know yet that this moment, this single glance in the quiet hallway, would mark the line between everything she thought she knew about control and everything she was about to learn about desire. The day went on, the city pulsing far below. But for Emma, the world had already tilted just a little, enough to know that something unseen had begun. The next morning began with the low hum of conversation spilling through the glass walls of the main boardroom. Papers rustled, keyboards clicked, and the faint sound of heels on marble echoed in rhythm. Emma sat near the end of the long oak table, her notepad open, a pen resting between her fingers. Her first executive meeting. The city glowed through the panoramic windows behind them, sunlight washing the room in gold. Alexander Stone stood at the head of the table, calm as still water. His posture alone commanded silence. No need for raised voices or theatrics, he had mastered the art of stillness. When he spoke, even the air seemed to lean in. Emma tried to focus on the slides projected on the glass wall, full of numbers, timelines, forecasts. But what caught her wasn't the data. It was the way he handled the room. Every question redirected with precision, every opinion weighed but never allowed to linger too long. He didn't dominate, he orchestrated. It was like watching a conductor lead an invisible symphony only he could hear. She wondered if that's what real power sounded like, quiet, deliberate, unhurried. When he glanced toward her, it wasn't to acknowledge her presence, just a fleeting scan across the room, but it was enough to make her spine straighten. That brief contact, that cold, steady gaze, it carried the weight of someone who saw everything, even things you thought you'd hidden well. The meeting stretched on. Voices rose and faded. Decisions were made. Deadlines shifted. Emma scribbled notes not because she needed to, but because it gave her something to hold on to. Her palms were damp, though she didn't understand why. Maybe it was the altitude 59 floors above the city made the air feel thinner, or maybe it was him. When the conversation turned toward a product delay, tension rippled through the table. Two senior directors argued over logistics, each trying to sound more certain than the other. Alexander didn't interrupt. He simply waited, eyes narrowing slightly, like a teacher watching children fight over crayons. When silence finally returned, he said softly, "You're both right and both missing the point." His tone wasn't harsh, but it left no room for ego. He outlined a new approach in 3 short sentences, each word deliberate. The directors nodded, chastened and relieved. Then, unexpectedly, he turned his gaze toward Emma. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice cutting through the room. "You've been observing quietly. Tell me, what do you sense the energy in this room?" The question hit her like a drop of cold rain. Dozens of eyes turned. Her heartbeat quickened. She could feel her pulse in her fingertips. She began, then paused. He waited, expression unreadable. There was no impatience in his silence, only an expectation that she would either rise or fall by her own measure. Emma drew a slow breath, remembering her professor's words. When you don't know the answer, describe what you see. "The energy," she said finally, voice steadying, "feels like a storm held back by walls. Everyone here wants to move to prove something but you." She stopped, unsure if she'd gone too far. "You anchor the room. You decide when the lightning strikes." A faint murmur rippled through the group. Alexander's brow lifted just slightly. Not surprise. Exactly, but intrigue. She continued, quieter now. "I think people work harder when they're slightly afraid of disappointing you. Not because of punishment, but because you never raise your voice. You make silence do the work." The room was still. Even the city outside seemed to pause. Alexander studied her, that unblinking gaze again. For a moment, she thought she'd crossed a line. Then, to everyone's astonishment, the corner of his mouth shifted, not a smile. Not quite. More like the ghost of one. "Interesting," he said simply, then turned back to the group. "Take a 5-minute break." Chairs scraped quietly as people stood. Conversations bloomed in low tones. Emma stayed seated, her pulse still racing. She didn't know if she'd just impressed him or ruined her internship on the second day. He approached her table, slow, deliberate steps. "You read the room better than most people who've been here for years," he said softly, hands in his pockets. "Don't mistake that for praise. Observation is a double-edged skill." Emma looked up, uncertain how to respond. "I wasn't trying to impress you, sir." "Good," he said. "That would have been the wrong reason to speak." Then, after a pause, "But you were right about one thing." She tilted her head. "Which part?" "The storm," he said, almost to himself. "You should learn when to stand close to it and when to step away." Then he walked toward the window, his reflection merging with the skyline. the morning sun turning his outline to gold. Emma watched him in silence. There was something in his voice that didn't sound like warning, more like experience, like he'd once stood too close himself and never quite recovered. Her coffee sat untouched, gone cold. The chatter around her faded again into the hum of machines, the click of keyboards. She could still feel the echo of his words. Later, when the meeting resumed, he didn't look at her again, but halfway through a presentation, as she adjusted the projector slides, she caught the faintest shift in his expression, a trace of curiosity, almost hidden. By the end of the day, her notepad was filled with sketches and phrases she barely remembered writing. But at the top of the page, one line stood out. Written in small, careful letters. Silence is a kind of language too. She read it once more before closing the notebook. A quiet ache blooming in her chest. Part admiration, part fear, part something unnamed. As she left the building that evening, the sun dipped behind the skyline, painting the glass towers in shades of amber and rose. The wind was cool, carrying the city's endless rhythm. Emma paused on the sidewalk, looking up at the glowing windows of the 59th floor. Somewhere up there, behind that light, a man stood untouchable, unknowable, and yet, somehow, already inside her thoughts. She exhaled, slow and steady. Something in her life had shifted. Not loudly, not visibly, just enough to make her heart feel slightly out of rhythm. And as the city lights blinked awake one by one, Emma knew whatever had started in that room wasn't over. It had only just begun. The rain came quietly that Monday morning, brushing against the tall windows of the 59th floor like a secret trying to be heard. Inside, the office lights glowed pale gold, reflecting off the marble floor and the polished steel edges of desks that seemed too perfect, too distant from human touch. Emma walked in early, her coffee still warm in her hand, her mind looping over one thought the way Alexander Stone had looked at her during that meeting. Not cold, not harsh, just searching. At exactly 8, Lauren from HR appeared beside her desk with an envelope. "Mr. Stone's orders," she said, lowering her voice. "You've been assigned as his direct observer this week." Emma blinked. Observer. Lauren shrugged, a small smile tugging at her lips. "You'll shadow him. Meetings, emails, internal reviews. He wants you to learn how decisions are made here." Then, leaning closer, she whispered, "No one gets this kind of access. Not even senior managers. Be careful. Okay, be careful." The words followed Emma as she stepped into Alexander's office for the first time. It was larger than she imagined, all glass and quiet, with a single black and white photo on the wall. A boy, maybe 10 years old, standing beside a lake, his face half turned away. Alexander was already at his desk, typing with focused precision. He didn't look up when she entered. "You'll sit there," he said, nodding to the small table near the corner. "Take notes. Don't interrupt unless I ask for input." "Yes, sir." His attention stayed on the screen. And Emma. "Yes. Don't call me sir." That was all, for hours. She watched him move through his day, his schedule timed down to the minute, his tone steady, his words trimmed of anything unnecessary. Every email he dictated sounded like a command disguised as courtesy. Every decision was clean, surgical. There was no space for hesitation, no glimpse of softness. And yet, beneath all that order, Emma sensed something else, a faint tremor in the way he avoided eye contact, as if he feared what he might reveal if he ever looked too long. At noon, a soft chime signaled a video call with a European client. Alexander motioned for her to stay. The call began with polite exchanges, then turned tense when the client pushed for an impossible delivery deadline. "You can't promise what you can't sustain," the man argued, his accent sharp. Alexander's reply was calm, almost quiet. "Stonebridge doesn't promise. It delivers." His tone didn't rise, but the authority in it made the room colder. The client relented, voice softening into agreement. Call ended. Silence filled the space again. Emma exhaled quietly, realizing she'd been holding her breath. "You disagree?" Alexander asked without looking up. She hesitated. "Not with your logic, but with your tone." He glanced up now, just for a second. "My tone? Yes. You didn't raise your voice, but you closed the door on empathy." He yielded, but he won't forget. A pause, the kind that felt like standing on a cliff's edge. Then the faintest flicker of amusement in his eyes. "You observe too much, Miss Carter. You asked me to." He almost smiled, but the expression died halfway. Fair point. For the first time that day, he leaned back in his chair, studying her instead of the screen. "Tell me, what do you think leadership is?" Emma thought carefully. "Maybe it's not about control. Maybe it's about presence. The way a person makes others feel safe enough to speak, brave enough to fail, and still keep trying." He said nothing, just looked at her, a strange stillness in his eyes. Then he turned back to his computer, typing something she couldn't see. "You can take a break," he said softly. 15 minutes. She stood. But before leaving, her eyes caught the photo on the wall again, the boy by the lake. "Is that you?" she asked without thinking. He froze, just a fraction of a second, but she saw it, the stiffness in his shoulders, the way his hand hesitated over the keyboard. "It was," he said finally. The word lingered in the air, was heavier than it should have been. When Emma returned later, the photo was gone. For the rest of the week, she followed him through meetings, conference calls, site visits. The more she saw, the more she understood why people feared him and why they couldn't look away. His brilliance was almost frightening. He remembered every number, every name, every missed deadline from months ago. But he also kept people at a distance so absolute it felt deliberate. He spoke to everyone, yet, somehow, to no one. Once, during a late afternoon meeting, she noticed him pause mid-sentence, eyes flicking toward the window. Outside, thunder rolled faintly over Manhattan. He didn't move for several seconds, just stood there, silent, like the sound had pulled him somewhere far away. Then, just as quickly, he returned to the conversation, but Emma saw something change in his face. Later that evening, as the office emptied, she found him still at his desk, the city lights painting his reflection across the glass. She approached quietly. "You should go home," she said softly. He didn't look up. "And what would I do there?" She opened her mouth, then closed it. There was no answer to that. He finally turned to her, his eyes dim but steady. "Do you know what silence sounds like when it's not peaceful?" She shook her head. "It sounds like memory," he said. Then he gathered his papers and stood. "You should rest, Miss Carter. Tomorrow will be longer." She watched him walk away, the sound of his footsteps fading into the hallway. Only the rain remained, tapping softly on the glass, like it was trying to speak for him. That night, Emma couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about that photo, the boy who was, and the man who now hid his gaze from every pair of eyes that tried to meet his. Maybe what he feared wasn't connection. Maybe it was what came after it, outside her window. The rain hadn't stopped. Somewhere in the city, Alexander Stone was probably still awake, working under that same sky. Two people, both restless, both chasing something they couldn't name. And though she didn't know it yet, this week, this strange assignment to watch him closely would change everything she thought she understood about strength, and about him. Because sometimes, the closer you look at someone, the less you're able to look away. The restaurant shimmered in late afternoon light, all glass and soft gold. The kind of place where every sound a fork against porcelain, a quiet laugh, the pop of a wine cork felt choreographed. Emma followed a few steps behind Alexander as the hostess led them to a long table draped in white linen. Around it sat the European delegation, polished suits, expensive watches, smiles that never reached their eyes. The air carried the faint scent of citrus and power. Alexander greeted them in fluent French, his tone smooth but distant. He introduced Emma as part of the leadership program, an observer. A small nod, polite and detached. She sat at his right, folding her napkin carefully to hide the tremor in her fingers. It was her first corporate lunch. She had practiced her composure, her smile, even the way she should hold her glass. But nothing prepared her for the way people's eyes measured her, as if trying to find the price tag. The conversation flowed easily at first. Markets, projections, mergers, all words she'd heard 1,000 times in lectures, but never like this. Never this sharp. She mostly listened, absorbing the rhythm, the subtle cues. Alexander's voice anchored the room again, steady as a metronome. Every sentence of his carried weight, and the others followed his lead almost unconsciously. Then, halfway through the second course, one of the guests, a man named Lucien Morel, leaned back with a smirk. His English came thick with a French accent, his tone dripping with charm that felt practiced. "So, Mr. Stone," he said, "you brought a little decoration to brighten up the meeting." The table chuckled, just lightly, but enough for the air to change. Emma froze. Her fork stopped midair. She felt heat rise to her face. Alexander said nothing. The silence stretched. Lucien went on. "I mean, no offense. She's lovely, must make long hours easier to bear." "No." Her throat tightened. The laughter returned, softer now, but cruel in its ease. Emma forced a small smile, the kind that said, "I'll pretend I didn't hear." Her heart beat faster. She could almost hear it over the murmur of the room. Then Alexander spoke calm, unhurried, his tone deceptively polite. "Mr. Morel," he said, "you're right about one thing. Miss Carter does make the hours easier because she understands numbers better than half the men in this room." The laughter died instantly. Forks lowered. Lucien blinked, caught between confusion and embarrassment. Alexander continued, still mild. "She's the one who spotted the margin flaw in your Geneva proposal draft. The one you sent last week." He tilted his head, a faint edge in his voice. "You remember that, don't you?" Lucien's face changed color. Perhaps that was Alexander didn't let him finish. "Don't mistake youth for ignorance, or grace for weakness. Not in my company." Then, almost as if nothing had happened, he turned to Emma. "Miss Carter, what's your take on the European logistics timeline?" Her hands trembled under the table, but she found her voice. "I think the projection can hold if the regional offices align procurement by Q2, she said softly. "Exactly." He nodded once. "See competence? A rare decoration indeed." The tension broke, but the energy in the room had shifted. Some smiled, some looked down, but everyone knew where the line had been drawn. For the rest of the meal, no one dared speak to Emma without purpose. She could breathe again, but her heart, it wasn't calm. It beat with something unfamiliar, something that wasn't fear or shame anymore. Gratitude, yes, but also warmth. When they left the restaurant, the city had softened under an overcast sky. The air smelled faintly of rain. Alexander walked beside her, his pace even, his hands in his pockets. She wanted to say thank you, but the words felt too small, so she waited. And he said, without looking at her, "You shouldn't let people like that get under your skin. I wasn't expecting," she began. "No one ever does." He cut in gently. "The world's full of people who mistake kindness for weakness. You don't need to explain yourself to them." She glanced up. "You didn't have to step in." "I didn't do it for you," he replied, eyes still fixed ahead. Then, after a pause, his voice softened. "I did it because I don't tolerate stupidity, especially when it disguises itself as humor." She smiled, the corners of her lips trembling. "Still, thank you." He didn't answer, but as they crossed the street, a car sped too close to the curb, splashing water toward them. Alexander reached out instinctively, his hand brushing her arm, pulling her slightly toward him. Just a second to touch, warm and steady. The kind that wasn't planned, the kind that left a mark. Their eyes met. For once, he didn't look away. The moment hung between them, fragile as breath. Then he released her, clearing his throat. "Be at the office early tomorrow. We have a review with the Zurich team." "Of course," she said, her voice almost a whisper. He gave a curt nod and walked ahead, the hem of his coat catching the wind. Emma stood for a second, watching him blend into the crowd, tall, composed, untouchable again. But something had cracked the surface that afternoon. She pressed her hand where his fingers had brushed her sleeve. It was absurd, really, how something so small could feel so electric. But it did. It pulsed in her skin like the echo of a flame. Later, on the subway ride home, she replayed it all in her head, the insult, his words, that moment by the street. The city lights flickered past the window, reflected in her eyes. And for the first time, she saw him differently. Not as the unreachable CEO everyone feared, but as a man who, without showing it, had just shielded her from humiliation. There was strength in his silence. But there was also gentleness, the kind that doesn't ask to be seen. The train slowed near her stop. She stood, gripping the rail. Outside, rain began to fall again, soft and persistent, like the world whispering something she couldn't yet name. And somewhere between the glow of the streetlights and the rhythm of the rain, Emma Carter realized maybe fire doesn't always begin with sparks. Sometimes, it begins with protection, with a hand reaching out, quietly, in the middle of a storm. The sky outside the windows had turned to amber, that fleeting hour when the city softened before night claimed it. Inside, the office was nearly empty. Most of the staff had gone home, leaving only the faint hum of computers and the distant echo of elevator doors closing somewhere far below. Emma sat at her desk, her eyes tired from the blue glow of the screen. Numbers, schedules, projections all blurring into one long string of thought. It had been a long day, but she didn't want to leave yet. Not while Alexander was still there. His office door stood half open, the warm light spilling across the floor. She could see him inside, jacket off, shirt sleeves rolled, focus unbroken as he reviewed a document spread across the desk. He looked less like the man people feared and more like someone quietly fighting time. Emma hesitated at the threshold before knocking softly. "Mr. Stone." He glanced up, his eyes meeting hers. For a second, he looked startled, as if he'd forgotten anyone else existed on this floor. Still, here I was, finishing the Zurich report. "I thought you might want a copy tonight." She stepped closer, holding out the folder. He accepted it, his fingers brushing hers. Just an instant, a simple exchange. But the moment stretched, thick with something neither of them could name. His hand was warm, steady. Hers was trembling. The touch lingered longer than it should have, not enough to cross a line, but enough to blur it. Alexander withdrew first, as if realizing it too late. He placed the file on his desk and took a slow breath. "You should go home, Miss Carter." His tone was calm, but his voice had changed softer, lower, like he was talking to someone he wasn't supposed to care about. Emma tried to smile. "You should too." He looked at her for a long moment, the faintest crease between his brows. "Some of us don't know where home is." The words landed somewhere deep inside her. She didn't know what to say, so she said nothing. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable this time, just fragile, like glass that might break if either of them breathed too loudly. She moved to gather her things, but her sleeve caught the corner of his pen. It rolled off the desk, landing by his chair. They both bent to reach for it, and that's when it happened. Her hand met his again, both of them frozen halfway down. The distance between them collapsed just a breath, a heartbeat, a mistake waiting to happen. She looked up, and he was already looking at her, close enough for her to see the faint shadows beneath his eyes, the tension hiding in the curve of his jaw. Neither moved, neither spoke. There was no sound except the faint rhythm of their breathing. Then Alexander stood abruptly, stepping back as if from a flame. His chair bumped the edge of the desk, startling the quiet. He turned away, running a hand through his hair, the control slipping just a little. I shouldn't have. He stopped himself. It's late. Emma straightened slowly, her heart beating so hard she thought he could hear it. It's fine, she said quietly. It was nothing. But it wasn't nothing, and both of them knew it. He didn't respond, just stared out the window, hands in his pockets, shoulders drawn tight, the skyline reflected in the glass behind him, 100 golden lights, all burning, none touching. After a while, he said, people talk, Miss Carter, about things that never happened. Be careful. She swallowed. Of course. The formality returned, but it didn't erase what had passed. The air between them still hummed, like the echo of music long after the last note fades. She gathered her bag, her fingers brushing the folder again, the one that had started it all. Before leaving, she turned back. You're not as unreadable as you think. You know. He looked over his shoulder, surprise flickering across his face. What makes you think that Emma smiled faintly? Because I used to think I could hide everything too. He didn't answer, just held her gaze. Something in his eyes, regret. Maybe, or fear. She couldn't tell. As she stepped into the hallway, the world outside had turned completely dark. Only the hum of the city below filled the silence. She walked toward the elevator, each step heavy with the weight of what almost happened and the strange ache of what didn't. When the doors closed behind her, Alexander remained at the window, watching the faint reflection of her departure. His hand rested against the glass, the city lights flickering across his skin. For a moment, his reflection looked like the man in that photo, younger, unguarded, lost. He whispered something under his breath, words too quiet for even the walls to hear. And in that still office, where the line between right and almost wrong had been drawn in invisible ink, both of them knew it. Something had changed, not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to leave a mark neither could wash away. Emma reached the ground floor, stepping out into the cool night. The streetlights shimmered against wet pavement. She inhaled deeply, trying to steady herself, but the scent of rain and cedar clung to her, the same one that lingered in his office. She looked up toward the 59th floor, where a single light still burned against the darkness. And she thought, quietly, this is where it begins to hurt. The morning light spilled gently across her desk, soft and pale, the kind of light that made everything look quieter than it really was. Emma sat with her coffee untouched, eyes tracing the edge of the report she was supposed to finish. Around her, the office moved in its usual rhythm, the low hum of printers, muffled phone calls, the click of shoes on marble floors. But she couldn't focus, not after what had happened last night. That accidental touch, that silence that said too much. Alexander's door was closed, as always. She'd seen him pass earlier, calm, composed, unreadable, no sign that anything had shifted. Yet she could still feel it, the tension that hovered like static in the air whenever he was near. Just before noon, when she returned from a meeting, there was something on her keyboard, a single business card, heavy cardstock, black with silver lettering, A. Stone. His handwriting precise, deliberate, ran across the back. Saturday, 7 p.m., and beneath it, a single line. If you want to understand me, her breath caught. It wasn't signed. It didn't need to be. For a long time, she just stared at it, feeling the pulse in her throat. The room seemed to shrink, her surroundings fading until all that existed was that small rectangle of paper and what it implied. She slipped the card into her notebook before anyone noticed. But all day, she felt its weight. Every time she typed an email or joined a meeting, she could feel it there, the question sitting in her bag, waiting for her to answer. By 5 o'clock, her thoughts were a blur. She left the office early, the late afternoon sun slicing through the city like liquid gold. The streets were crowded, but she barely noticed. Her mind kept circling back to that message. If you want to understand me, what did that mean that night? She tried to tell herself not to go. Tried to remember the boundaries, the rules, the whispered warnings about power and perception. But when she closed her eyes, she saw the way he had looked at her that evening, the pause, the retreat, the struggle in his voice. And beneath all that control, something human. Saturday came faster than she expected. She stood before her mirror just before 6, brushing invisible dust from her simple navy dress. Not too formal, not too casual. Still, she checked her reflection twice, uncertain of what she was walking into. The address led her far from the city's noise north, past the river, into the quiet outskirts of Vermont's wooded edge. The drive took nearly 2 hours. The sun dipped lower, the road narrowing until trees formed a canopy above her car. The GPS announced she had arrived, but there was no house, no sign of anyone. Just a narrow dirt path leading into the forest. Emma hesitated, heart pounding. Then she saw a faint light between the trees. She followed it. The air smelled of pine and earth, damp and clean. Each step deeper into the woods made the city feel like a distant dream. When she reached the clearing, she stopped. A cabin stood there, small and quiet, smoke curling from its chimney, the kind of place that didn't exist in the world of glass towers and boardrooms. He was there, waiting by the porch, no suit, no tie, just a dark sweater, sleeves rolled, eyes shadowed by the fading light. "Emma," he said simply. Her name sounded different in his voice, softer, like a confession. "You found it," he added. "I almost didn't come." He nodded once, as if he'd expected that. "But you did." Inside, the cabin smelled faintly of cedar and something older, maybe memory. The walls were lined with old photographs, most of them landscapes, a lake, a child holding a fishing pole, a woman's hand resting on the child's shoulder. Her face turned away from the camera. Emma looked at them quietly. "This was your place. My mother's," he said. "We used to come here every summer, before everything became business." There was no hardness in his voice now, just fatigue, the kind that doesn't come from work, but from years of pretending not to feel. They sat by the fireplace, the room flickering with light and shadow. For a long time, neither spoke. The silence wasn't awkward. This time, it was full, heavy, like it had been waiting for years to be shared. "Finally," Alexander said. "People think they know who I am. They see the title, the wealth, the control. They think that's what defines me." He paused, staring at the fire. "But control is just a form of fear. Emma, it's what you build when you can't trust anyone else to hold the pieces." She listened quietly, her heart tightening. He turned to her then. His gaze was steady, but softer than she had ever seen. "I brought you here because I wanted you to see where it started. The part of me that isn't Stonebridge, the part that still remembers being human." The fire crackled between them, its light dancing across his face. She wanted to say something, to reach across the space that still divided them, but the words wouldn't come. He leaned back slightly, his voice lower now. "You don't have to understand. Just know that every time I look at you, it feels like I could." Emma's breath caught. The sound of the fire filled the silence that followed. For a moment, the world outside that cabin ceased to exist. No boardrooms, no headlines, no rules, just two people, both afraid, both drawn towards something they couldn't undo. When she finally spoke, her voice was almost a whisper. "Why me?" He didn't answer right away, just studied her face, as if searching for something there, maybe an answer he'd lost long ago. Then, quietly, "Because you see me when I'm not trying to be seen." The firelight flickered, and she felt it again, that same pull, that same dangerous warmth that started with a single glance in an elevator. Outside, the wind moved through the trees, soft and rhythmic, like a heartbeat echoing the one she tried to steady. She knew, deep down, that crossing this threshold meant she couldn't return to who she was before. But she didn't move, and neither did he. The line between reason and feeling blurred again, fragile, trembling, alive. In the hush of that cabin, as night wrapped around the forest, Emma realized that understanding him might mean losing herself a little. And yet, part of her already had. The road curved deeper into the woods, the air growing colder with each mile. Emma watched from the passenger seat, her hands resting in her lap, fingers nervously twisting together. The forest around them was quiet, not empty, just alive in a slower way. Branches arched overhead, and the fading light painted the trees in long, amber streaks. Alexander drove with one hand on the wheel, eyes steady on the winding path ahead. He hadn't said much since they left the cabin, only small phrases now and then. Simple directions, quiet acknowledgments. Yet the silence between them wasn't uncomfortable anymore. It felt deliberate, safe. When they reached the clearing, the trees opened like a curtain. Before them stretched a lake, still and silver, mirroring the pale sky. The air smelled of pine and damp leaves. Near the shore stood an old wooden cabin, its porch half hidden by ivy. Smoke curled faintly from the chimney, as if the place had been waiting for them. Alexander stopped the car and stepped out, the crunch of gravel beneath his shoes breaking the stillness. Emma followed, the cold air brushing her face. "This is it," he said quietly, "where I learned that silence can mean different things." He led her toward the cabin. Up close, it looked worn, but not abandoned. A small swing hung by a single chain near the porch, swaying gently with the breeze. Inside, the scent of old wood and ash wrapped around them. A few framed photos lined the shelf above the fireplace, a woman's hand on a child's shoulder, a blurred image of a man half turned away. Emma's gaze softened. "Your parents." He nodded once. "My mother and I used to come here when I was little. She'd sit on the porch at dawn with her coffee. Tell me stories about the sky changing color. She said morning light was proof that no night lasts forever." He paused. "I stopped believing her when I turned 10. Emma watched him move through the small room, touching the back of a chair, adjusting a photo slightly, almost like revisiting a dream he wasn't sure was real anymore. His voice stayed calm, but there was a tremor beneath it, something that had never surfaced before. "She died when I was 14, he said quietly. After that, my father turned every emotion into a transaction. Grades, awards, accomplishments, everything had a price. He looked toward the window, where the reflection of the lake shimmered faintly. He used to say, 'Perfection is the only language people respect.' So I learned it. Emma didn't move, didn't interrupt, just listened, every word sinking deep. Alexander's eyes stayed fixed on the horizon. I thought if I could build something flawless, a company, a name, an image, it would make me worthy of the love I lost. But it doesn't work that way. You can't buy back what was given freely once." His voice cracked, just slightly, then steadied again. "So, I became what people expected. Cold, efficient, predictable, safer that way." Emma stepped closer, the floorboards creaking softly underfoot. "And are you?" she asked. "Safe." He let out a slow breath. "No, just contained." Outside, the wind shifted, rippling across the lake. She could hear the soft lapping of water against the shore, the whisper of branches brushing the cabin roof. It felt like the world had paused just for them, the trees holding their breath, the light dimming into a gentle hush. Alexander turned toward her then, his expression unreadable but raw. "You make it harder," he said softly. She frowned. Harder to stay contained. There it was, the truth neither of them had dared to touch. It hung between them, fragile, shimmering like the reflection on the water outside. Emma wanted to speak, but her throat tightened. Instead, she looked out the window, the sky now deepening into twilight. She must have loved this place, she said finally. She did. He followed her gaze. She said the lake remembered, that it carried echoes of every laugh, every secret whispered to it. Do you still believe that I want to? They stood side by side for a long while, watching the sun disappear behind the trees. The last light bled into the surface of the water, turning it into liquid gold before fading into silver. When the first stars appeared, Alexander lit the old fireplace. The flame crackled to life, warm and slow. He sat on the floor near it, motioning for her to join him. For a moment. Emma hesitated, then she did. The warmth of the fire brushed her skin, the light catching in her hair. He glanced at her, and for the first time since she met him, he didn't look away. I never told anyone any of this, he said quietly. Not even my father. Especially not him. She met his gaze. Then why me? His eyes softened, because you listen without trying to fix it. You see without demanding proof. The fire popped, a small spark drifting upward, fading before it reached the chimney. Emma wanted to reach out to touch his hand, to offer something human against all that loneliness, but she didn't. The restraint was its own ache. Outside, the lake caught the moonlight, still and perfect. Inside, the air carried a quiet that wasn't empty. It was something else. The sound of two lives, both bruised by expectation, both searching for what still made them feel alive. When Emma finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. Maybe perfection isn't what she meant by light. He looked at her, something unreadable in his expression. What did she mean? Then, maybe it's this, she said. When someone finally sees you, and you let them. He didn't reply, but his eyes held hers, not with power this time, but with something tender, almost afraid. The fire flickered, painting the room in gold. Outside, the night deepened, wrapping the world in quiet. And somewhere in that quiet, something between them shifted again, subtle, irreversible, like the tide turning beneath a calm surface. Emma didn't know what tomorrow would bring, or what this night would cost them both. She only knew that, when Alexander Stone looked at her now, he wasn't the man from the 59th floor anymore. He was just a boy by a lake, remembering how to breathe. The sun was sinking behind the pines when they stepped outside, the light folding gently over the lake like a soft blanket. The air was cool, touched by the scent of wet earth and wood smoke. Somewhere far off, a bird called once, then fell silent. Emma walked beside Alexander down the narrow path to the water's edge, their footsteps slow, careful, as if speaking too loudly might wake something sacred in the stillness. The surface of the lake shimmered, half gold, half shadow. She could see their reflections moving together, not quite touching, but close enough that the ripples blended them into one. Alexander stopped near the old wooden dock, his hands in his pockets, his gaze fixed on the horizon. It looks the same, he said quietly. Every time I come here, I think it will have changed. But it never does. Emma stood beside him, folding her arms gently against the chill. Maybe that's what makes it safe, she said. Everything else changes. The lake stays. He turned to her then, his eyes catching the last trace of sunlight. Do you ever feel like you've been running your whole life? She thought for a moment. Maybe not running, just trying to keep up. He nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. I think I forgot what it feels like to stop. Silence again. But it wasn't empty. It was the kind of quiet that holds everything unsaid, the kind that hums softly between two people who already understand. The wind shifted, brushing her hair across her cheek. Without thinking, he reached out and tucked the loose strand behind her ear. His touch was gentle, almost hesitant, like he wasn't sure if he was allowed. Her breath caught. The world around them seemed to slow the lake, the light, even the sound of their hearts. He drew his hand back, but his eyes stayed on hers. Emma. The way he said her name low, Unguarded felt like something unraveling. She could feel her pulse in her throat, in her fingertips, in the air itself. He took a step closer, his voice barely above a whisper. I told myself I wouldn't cross this line, that I couldn't. She didn't move. Couldn't. But then you walked into that elevator, he said, his voice rougher now, and for the first time in years, I wasn't sure who I was anymore. She felt the ache in those words, the weight of everything he'd been holding back. He looked away then, toward the lake, as if afraid of what he might see in her face. I don't know what this is supposed to be. I just know that when you're near, the noise stops. The world makes sense again. And I don't know how to turn that off. Her throat tightened. The firelight from the cabin flickered faintly behind them, painting the edges of the dock in gold. Alexander, she began, her voice soft, unsure. But he turned back to her, and in that look, that raw, quiet look, there was no command, no armor, no title, just a man, terrified of how much he needed someone. I'm in love with you, he said. The words fell between them like a confession and a surrender all at once. Emma didn't speak. She couldn't. Her heart was too full with fear, with tenderness, with something she had been trying not to name since the day she first met him. He took a small step closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him in the cold air. His hand hovered near her cheek, not touching, just there, asking, not demanding. And she leaned forward first. The kiss was soft, uncertain, trembling, not the kind born of impulse, but of restraint finally breaking. It tasted of rain and fire, of all the words they hadn't said. For a moment, the world fell away, no past, no consequences, just the sound of water lapping gently at the shore and the steady rhythm of two hearts finding each other. When they pulled apart, the air between them was trembling. Her hands were still resting lightly against his chest, feeling the quiet strength beneath. He didn't speak, neither did she. They just stood there, breathing the same fragile air, both knowing something irreversible had begun. The sky had deepened to indigo now, streaked with the last gold of sunset. The first star blinked awake above the lake. He reached up, brushing his thumb against her lower lip, a silent question in his eyes. She closed her eyes, pressing her forehead lightly against his. The warmth of his skin, the faint scent of cedar, it all felt like memory already. This shouldn't be happening, she whispered. I know, but it is. He let out a quiet breath, then let it. She opened her eyes, meeting his gaze. There was no promise there, no certainty, just the fragile honesty of two people standing on the edge of something they didn't yet understand. A single drop of rain landed on her shoulder, then another. Soon the sky was misting lightly, the kind of rain that didn't chase you away, only made you feel more alive. They stayed there as the rain fell, the world around them dissolving into silver and shadow. Emma didn't know if it was love or madness that made her stay. But she knew this. She didn't want to go back to the life before this moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft, almost lost beneath the sound of rain. You don't have to be afraid. She smiled faintly, though her voice shook when she answered, I already am. He looked at her, the faintest trace of sadness in his eyes. So am I. The rain deepened, the surface of the lake rippling under its touch, and in that trembling reflection, their silhouettes melted into one. The kiss, the confession, the quiet that followed it all felt fragile, like light on water, beautiful, fleeting, impossible to hold. And yet, as the night folded around them, neither one moved, because sometimes, knowing it could all break is the very reason you hold on tighter. Morning came softly, filtered through the wide glass windows of the 59th floor. The city stirred far below, unaware of what had changed in the quiet space between two people. Emma walked into the office early, earlier than usual, the air still holding that fragile calm that comes before the day begins. Her reflection in the elevator doors looked almost like someone else, a little dazed, a little afraid. She pressed her lips together, as if trying to hide what her heart already knew. Alexander was already there. He stood by the window, jacket off, sleeves rolled up, the pale light brushing against the sharp lines of his face. When she entered, he turned slightly, their eyes meeting for just a moment, one heartbeat too long. Then he looked away. "Morning," he said. His voice was steady, practiced. "Morning," she replied, matching his tone, though her throat felt tight. For the rest of the morning, they moved like two dancers pretending not to share a song. He gave instructions, she took notes. They avoided proximity, avoided the kind of silence that used to mean something. But beneath the surface, beneath every careful word, every clipped exchange was the memory of the night by the lake, the touch, the confession, the kiss that still echoed in the space between them. Emma tried to keep her focus on her work, but it was impossible not to feel it, the electricity that hummed every time she sensed him near. Even his silence carried weight now, a presence she couldn't ignore. Just before noon, the double doors of the boardroom opened with a quiet click. A man stepped out, older, taller, his hair silver, his suit darker than night. His gaze swept the office like a blade. Richard Stone. Emma had seen his photos in company press releases, the legendary founder, the visionary who built Stonebridge from nothing. But in person, he didn't look like a visionary. He looked like a storm that had outlived its season and refused to die. When his eyes found her, she froze. So that's where Alexander's stillness came from. She saw it instantly. The same posture, the same control, only colder. "Miss Carter." "Isn't it?" Richard's voice was smooth, polite, but laced with something that didn't belong in courtesy. "Yes, sir." He studied her for a moment, his gaze unreadable. "My son speaks highly of your work." Her pulse stuttered. "That's very kind of him." Richard's smile didn't reach his eyes. Kindness has little to do with it. Alexander doesn't give praise easily. Behind her, she could feel Alexander step closer, his presence steady, protective. "Father," he said quietly, "is there something you needed?" Richard turned toward him with the measured patience of a man who was used to control, only to understand what's distracting my CEO from more pressing matters. The air tightened. Emma's hand curled around the edge of the desk. Alexander's tone stayed calm. "There's nothing distracting me." Richard's eyes flicked back to Emma. "Let's hope not." He moved closer to her now, his cologne sharp, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "Stonebridge is not a place for sentiment, Miss Carter. Ambition can look like innocence, and innocence can be dangerous when it doesn't know its limits." Her breath caught, then still soft, almost gentle. He added, "Don't step across a line you can't come back from." The words sliced through her like cold water. Alexander's jaw tightened. "That's enough." Richard smiled faintly, a predator's smile hidden behind civility. "Of course, just a conversation." He straightened his cuff, his eyes lingering on his son. "Don't let your emotions ruin what we've built." And with that, he left the door closing behind him with a slow, final sound. The silence that followed was unbearable. Emma didn't know what to say. She could still feel the echo of Richard's warning in her chest. She turned toward Alexander, but he was already facing the window again, his hands gripping the railing. "I'm sorry," she whispered. He shook his head. "You have nothing to apologize for. He knows," she said softly. "Doesn't he?" Alexander exhaled, the sound tired, almost defeated. "He knows everything. He always has." For a moment, the world outside felt impossibly far away, the hum of the city, the rhythm of work, all drowned out by the heaviness between them. "I shouldn't have let this happen," he said finally. His voice was quiet, but it carried a kind of pain that made her chest ache. "He'll turn it into something ugly. That's what he does." Emma stepped closer, her words trembling. "Then don't let him." He looked at her, now really looked, and in his eyes, she saw both the man who had protected her and the boy who had spent his life trying to be enough. "It's not that simple," he said. "I know," she whispered, "but neither is what we have." He didn't respond. His gaze drifted back to the city, to the endless stretch of glass and steel that bore his family's name. For a while, they just stood there, the distance between them growing even as neither of them moved. Then he said, so softly she almost didn't hear, "He'll come after you, not me. That's how he works." Emma's voice steadied, though her heart did not. "Let him." He turned then, surprise flickering across his face, not at her defiance, but at her courage. The kind that didn't shout, only stood its ground quietly. Something softened in him for a moment, then hardened again. "Be careful. Emma, you don't know what he's capable of." She met his gaze. "Maybe not, but I know what you're capable of, and I don't believe you'll let him destroy this." His expression faltered a flicker of something close to hope. Then he looked away, the armor returning. "Go home for today," he said finally. "Please." She wanted to argue, but something in his voice, not command, not distance, just exhaustion, stopped her. As she gathered her things, she caught his reflection in the glass, a man standing in a tower he'd built, staring down at the shadows his father still cast. Before leaving, she turned back to him. "You don't have to be him. Alexander?" He didn't answer, but she saw the smallest movement in his shoulders, like a breath he couldn't quite take. The elevator doors closed behind her with a soft hum, and in that quiet descent, 59 floors down, away from the man who both frightened and moved, her Emma Carter understood something she hadn't before. Love wasn't the hardest part. Surviving it might be. The next morning, the sky over Manhattan was a dull, untrustworthy gray, the kind that seemed to hold its breath before rain. Emma arrived early, trying to blend into the rhythm of the office, but whispers followed her like shadows, glances that lingered half a second too long, conversations that stopped when she passed. It didn't take long for her to understand something had changed, something she couldn't yet see, but could feel in the air the shift before a storm. By noon, her phone buzzed. A message from the executive assistant, Mr. Richard Stone, requests to see you. Conference room 23. Her stomach dropped. She hesitated for a moment, then stood, smoothing her blazer, her fingers trembling just enough for her to notice. The walk down the hallway felt longer than usual. The glass walls reflected her face back at her calm, polite, rehearsed. When she entered the room, Richard was already there. No assistants, no distractions. Just him, standing by the window, hands clasped behind his back. "Miss Carter," he said without turning. "Please, sit." His tone was civil, almost gentle, and that frightened her more than anger would have. She sat, the chair cool beneath her hands. He turned then, his gaze sharp but measured. "I've done my research on you. Columbia MBA, scholarship recipient, background in behavioral analytics, promising, focused, a future worth investing in." She didn't respond. He walked closer, slow, deliberate, "which is why I'm offering you something most people would only dream of." He slid an envelope across the table. It was thick, heavy official. "Full scholarship for your at Stanford," he continued, "and a guaranteed position afterward at Alden Tech in Boston. Triple your current pay." Emma looked down at the envelope but didn't touch it. "And what do you want in return?" He smiled faintly, the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes. Discretion and distance. Her heart sank. "You're intelligent enough to see where this is going." "Miss Carter," he said softly, "you and my son. This little connection, whatever you think it is, will destroy him. And you." She swallowed hard, her throat tight. "You think this is about ambition?" "This is about survival," he said, voice low, precise. Alexander doesn't understand how this world works anymore, but I do. And people like you? He paused, his tone softening, almost pitying. They get crushed when they forget the rules. She met his gaze then, steady, unflinching. Maybe your rules are what's broken. For the first time. His expression faltered a flicker of annoyance behind the calm. Don't mistake courage for wisdom, he warned. Take the offer, Miss Carter. Walk away before this becomes irreversible. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the table. No. A long silence followed, heavy enough to make the air feel colder. Then he straightened, sliding the envelope back toward himself. Then you leave me no choice. He turned toward the window again, hands clasped once more, as if dismissing her. You can go. She rose slowly, her heart pounding, and walked toward the door. Before she could open it, his voice stopped her. One last thing, he said. When the headlines come, don't pretend you weren't warned. The chill in his words followed her out of the room like smoke. By the time she reached her desk, she could already feel the shift in the office's atmosphere. Screens lit up with notifications, phones buzzed, people whispered not the casual hum of gossip, but the sharp edge of scandal. Her phone vibrated again. Emma Carter and CEO Alexander Stone. Inappropriate relationship rumors spark internal probe. Her chest tightened. The article was already live. Her name, his. A blurred photo of them leaving the same elevator weeks ago. The comments below were merciless words like favoritism, manipulation, affair. She felt the ground tilt beneath her. Within minutes, her inbox flooded with questions, messages, requests for comment. She turned off her phone. Her hands were cold. Across the office, Alexander's door slammed shut. Moments later, he emerged, his expression unreadable, eyes dark with restrained fury. Every pair of eyes in the room followed him. He didn't speak to anyone, just walked straight toward her. Come with me, he said quietly. They entered the empty conference room, closing the door behind them. For a moment, neither spoke. Then she said, voice shaking, he did this. Alexander nodded once, jaw clenched. Of course he did. I told him no, she whispered. I told him I wouldn't leave. Something flickered in his eyes, pride, pain, both at once. He's forcing my hand, Alexander said. He knows I won't stay silent if he attacks you. Emma took a step closer. Then don't let him win. He met her gaze, his control fraying just slightly. You don't understand. The board, the shareholders, they'll use this to push me out. Everything I've built, everything my mother's memory stood for. She cut him off gently. Alexander, what we've built is still real, even if he tries to tear it down. The way she said we made him go still. Outside the glass wall, the city looked indifferent, gleaming and cold. He reached up, rubbing his temple as if fighting back the weight of it all. He's not going to stop, not until he destroys one of us. Then he'll have to face both, she said softly. For a long moment, they just stood there, two people caught in the eye of something much larger than themselves. The hum of the office outside was muffled now, distant, as though the world had drawn a curtain between them and everything else. Finally, Alexander said, his voice low, you should go home. Don't answer any calls. Don't talk to the press. And you, I'll deal with him. She wanted to believe him, but the storm outside that glass felt bigger than either of them. When she finally left the building, rain had begun to fall slow, deliberate drops that darkened the pavement as she walked. Each step echoed against the quiet street, the weight of the day pressing down on her shoulders. Somewhere above her, the city kept moving. Lights flickered, voices blurred, but inside, something in her had gone still. Because deep down, she knew this wasn't just about love anymore. It was about power, and power, once challenged, never forgives easily. The storm didn't hit all at once. It started quietly, a headline on a business blog, a tweet that caught fire, A photograph taken through the tinted glass of a black car. By noon, it was everywhere. The billionaire and the intern. Inside Stonebridge's secret affair. The kind of words that travel faster than truth ever could. Emma sat frozen at her desk. The screen before her flashing with notification after notification. Every message from someone she knew came with a question, or worse, sympathy. The whispers from the office had turned into open stares now. She could feel them pressing against her back, the judgment, the curiosity, the quiet cruelty that blooms when people smell scandal. Her phone buzzed again. A call from HR. She didn't answer. Across the glass floor, Alexander's door stayed closed, but she could see movement inside, silhouettes pacing, voices raised, then silenced. She wished she could reach him, but the wall between them felt higher than ever. By 2 o'clock, the company issued a statement, short, sterile, cold. An internal review has been initiated regarding alleged misconduct involving CEO Alexander Stone. The words made her stomach twist. Alleged misconduct. They made it sound sordid, transactional, cheap. She wanted to scream, to tell them it wasn't that. It wasn't power or manipulation or ambition. It was real. But the world never believes love that crosses lines of hierarchy. It always assumes calculation. At 4, a security officer appeared by her desk. His voice was low, apologetic. "Miss Carter, they need you in conference room A." The walk down the hallway felt endless. She could feel the eyes of every employee following her, a walk of quiet humiliation. When she entered the room, the air was thick with formality. A long table, a panel of faces, and Alexander at the far end. His tie was gone, his sleeves rolled, but his posture, his composure remained unshaken. Next to him sat Richard Stone, perfect suit, perfect smile, the puppeteer pretending to be an observer. "Miss Carter," the head of HR said, folding her hands. "Thank you for coming. We need to clarify a few matters before tomorrow's board session." Emma nodded, forcing her voice to steady. "Of course." They asked questions that stung more than accusations about late nights, about meetings, about intent, each one phrased like a trap. She answered truthfully, but truth, in rooms like these, is never the point. At one point, she looked up and caught Alexander's gaze. It was only for a second, but it was enough a silent apology, a promise, a plea. When they dismissed her, she rose slowly. Richard spoke before she could leave. "Miss Carter," he said smoothly, "may I have a word?" The others cleared out, and once the door clicked shut, his expression shifted. The smile vanished. "I warned you," he said softly. "You could have had a future. Now you've tied it to his downfall." Emma stood still. "You think you can destroy him?" Richard's voice dropped to a whisper. "I don't need to. He'll destroy himself. All I have to do is let him choose." "Choose," she repeated, her voice trembling. "Between you and everything he's built." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "He's a stone. Stones don't love. They lead." She met his gaze, her fear replaced with quiet defiance. "Maybe he'll prove you wrong." Richard tilted his head slightly, almost pitying. "You don't understand. I raised him to never lose. That includes you." The door opened then. Alexander stepped in, his eyes flicking between them. Richard smiled faintly. "We were just finishing up." When his father left, the silence that followed was suffocating. "Emma," Alexander said softly, "he's going to push this to the board. He'll make it official." She nodded. "I know. He's giving me a choice," he said, his voice hollow. "Resign quietly or let them remove me publicly. Either way, you'll be dragged through it." Her heart clenched. "So, what will you do?" He looked at her not as a CEO, not as a man used to control, but as someone standing at the edge of everything he's ever known. "I don't know yet." For a long moment, neither spoke. The rain had started outside, tapping softly against the windows, the same rhythm as the night by the lake. The memory of warmth now replaced by the chill of consequence. She stepped closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "Whatever happens, don't let him take away who you are." He smiled faintly, but his eyes were heavy. "You still believe there's something left worth saving?" "Yes," she said simply. "Because I've seen it." He turned away, his reflection fractured in the glass. "Tomorrow morning," he said quietly. "Board meeting at 9. She wanted to reach out, to touch his hand, but she didn't. Instead, she just said, "I'll be there." He looked at her sharply. "You don't have to be." "I do." Her voice was steady, even though her heart was breaking, because she knew this wasn't just a fight for a job, or a company, or even for love. It was a fight for truth, for the right to not be ashamed of feeling. When she left the building that night, the city lights were blurry with rain. She didn't know how tomorrow would end. She only knew that no matter what Richard Stone believed, there were things in this world stronger than power, but they always came at a cost. And as the thunder rolled over Manhattan, Emma understood that dawn would not bring calm. It would bring reckoning. The night before the board meeting, the city refused to sleep. Screens still glowed with headlines that twisted truth into spectacle. Reporters waited in the lobby like vultures, ready to feed on whatever remained of Stonebridge's dignity. Inside Alexander's penthouse, silence filled the space like smoke. Emma sat near the window, her reflection faint against the glittering skyline. Neither of them had spoken for a long time. Words felt too fragile for what was coming. He stood by the kitchen counter, phone in hand, unread messages piling up. His tie hung loose, the weight of the day heavy on his shoulders. "They'll call for a vote tomorrow," he said finally. "The board's divided. My father's been convincing." Emma turned slightly, her voice low but steady. "You don't have to go down quietly." He smiled faintly, but it didn't reach his eyes. "That's the problem with power. It's rarely taken quietly. It's usually ripped away." She looked at him, the man who had built empires out of structure, logic, control, now standing on the edge of losing everything because he dared to feel. Before she could speak, a soft knock broke through the silence. Alexander frowned. It was almost midnight. He opened the door to find a young man standing there, a little out of breath, a messenger bag slung across his shoulder. He looked barely 22, nervous but determined. "Mr. Stone," he said quickly. "I'm Noah Green. I'm one of the interns from Strategy." Alexander's tone softened slightly. "Noah? What are you doing here at this hour?" Noah hesitated, eyes darting to Emma before focusing on him again. "I think I can help you. Both of you." Emma stood, cautious. "Help us." How he stepped forward, lowering his voice. "You don't know me, and I get that this looks crazy, but I need you to hear me out before you decide I'm wasting your time." He took a shaky breath, pulling a small flash drive from his pocket. "I have proof about the photos, the story, all of it." Alexander exchanged a look with Emma, then gestured toward the table. "Show me." Noah connected the drive to Alexander's laptop, his hands trembling slightly as he navigated the files. "My roommate, Owen, he's a freelance photographer. A few weeks ago, he told me he got a cash job from some agency he didn't recognize. They said they wanted candid photos of Stonebridge executives for a potential PR campaign. I didn't think much of it until the story broke yesterday. The photos looked familiar." He clicked open a folder. Images filled the screen, Emma and Alexander leaving the elevator, standing too close in a hallway. A reflection caught in a cafe window. Noah continued, voice low. "I asked him who hired him. He didn't know exactly, just said he was paid through a company called Vestra Communications. I did some digging. Vestra doesn't exist, not really. It's a shell company." Alexander leaned closer. "Owned by who?" Noah clicked again, pulling up a document, a transaction log, clean and damning. "It took me a while. but the payment trail leads back to one of your father's private accounts. He used Vestra to funnel the money through 3 different firms. Classic laundering tactic. I have the statements, the audio messages, everything. Owen even kept a voicemail where a man, I'm guessing one of your father's people, gave him specific instructions. He pressed play. A cold, measured voice filled the room. Make sure the shots imply intimacy. We don't need proof. Just doubt. The sound hit like a blade. Emma looked away, her hands curling into fists. Alexander closed his eyes, the truth sinking in, heavy but clarifying. For a long time, no one spoke. Only the city outside moved the hum of traffic, the pulse of neon, indifferent to the collapse and revelation happening behind glass walls. When Alexander finally spoke, his voice was quiet but steady. Why are you doing this? Noah? Noah looked down, embarrassed. Because it's wrong. I saw what they're saying about her, about both of you. I know what it's like to be powerless, to be used by people who think their money can rewrite reality. He hesitated. And because I owe you, you approved my internship even though I didn't come from the right school. You didn't know it. But that changed my life. Emma felt her throat tighten. Alexander studied the young man. Something soft, flickering in his expression. Something like pride. You understand what this means? If you go through with it, Richard Stone doesn't lose. And he doesn't forgive. Noah nodded. Then he can hate me. I'm not afraid. The room fell into silence again, the weight of what he'd brought settling like dust after a storm. Finally, Alexander spoke. Tomorrow morning, I'll call an emergency board meeting. This time, we won't defend ourselves. We'll expose the truth. Emma's heart raced. You're sure about this? He turned to her, his eyes calmer than they had been in days. If I stay silent, he wins twice, once by ruining us, and again by proving I've become him. Noah looked between them, his voice small but firm. I'll stand by what I found. You have my word. Alexander nodded. Thank you. Noah, you've done more than you know. As the young man left, Emma walked toward the window, her reflection overlapping with Alexander's in the glass. Do you think it'll be enough? She asked softly. He stepped beside her, his hand hovering close but not touching. Maybe not, but it's the truth, and that's more than we've had until now. The city stretched out before them, vast, luminous, unforgiving. Somewhere below, the headlines were already shifting, reshaping the story again. But for the first time in days, Emma felt a flicker of something she hadn't dared to name. Hope. It was fragile, almost foolish, but it was there, alive and trembling between them like the heartbeat of a second chance. She turned to him, her voice quiet. What will you tell them tomorrow? He looked out at the skyline, his reflection steady. The truth, he said. All of it. And though the storm still waited outside, she could feel at the smallest break in the clouds, the first thread of light trying to find its way through. The morning of the board meeting felt heavier than any storm the city had ever seen. The air inside Stonebridge Tower carried a kind of silence that made even footsteps sound intrusive. The entire building seemed to hold its breath. Alexander walked through the lobby like a man stepping into battle, not with armor or fury, but with the calm of someone who had finally stopped running from himself. Emma followed a few steps behind, her heart pounding, but her face steady. She wasn't just an intern anymore. She was someone who had seen behind the mask and chosen to believe anyway. The elevator ride to the 60th floor was slow, each ding marking another moment closer to truth. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. The silence between them wasn't fear, it was understanding. When the doors opened, the boardroom waited a long glass table, 12 seats, and the weight of decades of power arranged neatly around it. Cameras were off, but phones were ready. Everyone knew this wasn't just an internal meeting. This was a reckoning. Richard Stone sat at the head of the table, calm, composed, a man who believed the game was already won. His expression didn't change when his son entered. He just offered a small, measured nod, as if greeting a worthy opponent. "Alexander," he said smoothly, "let's begin. The board has questions about your conduct and about your judgment." Alexander took his seat, setting a folder on the table. He looked around the room, meeting each director's eyes one by one. "Then I'll start with the truth." He stood, his voice steady but low. "You've all seen the stories. You've read the headlines. You've been told that I abuse my position, that I let emotion cloud reason." He paused. "That isn't true." Richard leaned back slightly, his tone measured. "Be careful. Son, words have consequences. So do lies." Alexander replied. The room shifted, a subtle tightening of shoulders. The sound of a breath caught somewhere in the corner. He opened the folder and slid a series of printed documents across the table: financial transfers, time-stamped emails, and a recording transcript. "This," he said, "is evidence that the photos and articles weren't accidents. They were orchestrated, funded through a shell company called Vestra Communications." He turned, meeting his father's gaze. "A company that traces back to you." For a moment, even the air stopped moving. Richard didn't flinch. "That's a serious accusation." "It's not an accusation," Alexander said softly. "It's a fact, and I can prove it." He played the recording. The same cold, familiar voice filled the room, Richard's assistant, giving instructions to the hired photographer. The words were simple, devastating. "Make sure the shots imply intimacy. We don't need proof, just doubt." When the playback ended, no one spoke. The stillness was absolute. One of the board members, an older woman with silver hair and sharp eyes, broke the silence. "Is this verified?" "Yes," Alexander said. "The transactions, the accounts, all authenticated by an independent auditor. Mr. Green, one of our interns, uncovered the trail. I have copies of everything." Richard's jaw tightened. "You're reaching, Alexander. Even if this were true, it doesn't erase your lapse in judgment. You mixed personal and professional boundaries. That's enough to compromise leadership?" Alexander's eyes softened, but his voice didn't waver. "You're right. I did cross a line. I let someone matter more than the walls I built. But if love makes me unfit to lead, then maybe I've been protecting the wrong thing all this time." The words landed like a quiet explosion. He looked around the table again, calm, clear, every syllable deliberate. Stonebridge was never meant to be a monument to control. It was supposed to be about innovation, about human connection. Somewhere along the way, we traded heart for fear, and fear, he paused, glancing toward his father, is what truly ruins a company. Richard's voice hardened. "This is sentiment, not strategy. You're standing here because you can't separate weakness from leadership." "No," Alexander said. "I'm standing here because I finally stopped pretending that compassion is weakness." A murmur rippled through the room, quiet, uncertain, but real. For the first time, Richard's control wavered. Alexander reached into the folder once more and laid down one final document, a signed motion, calling for an internal ethics investigation. "I've already requested a formal review of my conduct, and of yours. Whatever this company decides, I'll accept it." The head of HR, sitting near the end of the table, adjusted her glasses. "The board will need to deliberate." "Do it now," Alexander said gently. "Let's stop hiding behind procedure." The board members exchanged glances, the tension in the air sharp enough to hum. One by one, they raised their hands to vote. The silence stretched. When the count was over, the verdict was clear. Richard Stone suspended pending investigation. For the first time in his life, Alexander saw something in his father's eyes he'd never seen before. Not anger, not disappointment. Something quieter. Defeat. Richard rose slowly, straightening his jacket. "You think you've won," he said, "but all you've done is tear down what I built." Alexander met his gaze. "Then maybe it's time to rebuild it differently." Richard's eyes lingered on him for a long, unreadable moment. Then he turned and walked out, the door closing softly behind him. When the room finally exhaled, it was Emma who moved first. She had been sitting quietly in the corner, unnoticed by most of them, a witness, a reminder of what the truth had cost. As Alexander turned toward her, she smiled faintly, not triumphant, just relieved. He walked over to her, his shoulders lowering for the first time in days. "It's over," he said quietly. "Not yet," she replied. "But it's beginning to be." He looked out through the glass wall, the city stretching endless and alive beyond it. "The company's safe. So are we," she said. He nodded slowly, the weight of everything settling and lifting at once. "I don't know what happens next." Emma took his hand, a gesture so simple it didn't need permission. "Then let's find out together." Outside. The rain had stopped. The sky, once heavy and gray, was breaking open, streaks of light cutting through the clouds, and somewhere between the noise of the city and the silence of the room, Alexander Stone, the man who had built his life on control, realized that for the first time, he wasn't afraid to feel, because the empire hadn't fallen. It had changed shape, and so had he. The weeks after the board meeting felt like the slow thaw after a long, relentless winter. The tension that had once haunted every hallway of Stonebridge began to fade not all at once, but gradually, like morning light creeping through a half-open curtain. Alexander arrived at the office earlier than anyone, not because he had to, but because he wanted to feel the building breathe again. The glass walls, the hum of computers, the low murmur of early meetings. It all sounded different now, less like control, more like life. Emma stood beside him that morning, overlooking the city from the 60th floor. The skyline shimmered against the pale gold of sunrise. She turned toward him, a quiet smile touching her lips. "You know," she said softly, "it doesn't have to be Stonebridge anymore." He looked at her, curious. "What do you mean?" She let the thought hang for a moment before speaking. "Stonebridge was built on your father's idea of perfection. Maybe it's time to build something on yours." Alexander didn't answer right away. He just looked out at the horizon, where the river caught the sun like a ribbon of glass. Then, finally, he said, "Not mine, ours." That afternoon, the new name appeared in silver lettering on the main lobby wall, Stone Carter Innovations. The hyphen wasn't just design, it was declaration, a bridge between power and purpose, steel and soul. At first, people whispered about it, how an intern's name could stand beside a CEO's. But as days turned to weeks, the whispers quieted. Because, slowly, quietly, something began to shift. Emma's new office wasn't the biggest. It wasn't meant to be. She refused the corner view, choosing instead a smaller glass room on the third floor where the interns worked, where the young engineers argued over code and caffeine. Her title read Director of Human Development, but what she built went far beyond HR. She changed how the company listened. She replaced performance reviews with reflection sessions, where managers learned to ask, not judge. She opened anonymous suggestion rooms, both physical and digital, where anyone from janitors to developers could speak without fear. Once, Alexander had measured progress by quarterly reports. Now, he measured it by laughter in the cafeteria, by the number of people who stayed late not because they had to, but because they wanted to. And through it all, he watched Emma, not the way he had in those first days, not with hunger or hesitation, but with something deeper. Respect, admiration, love that had grown past the fire of infatuation into something quieter, steadier. One evening, after most of the staff had gone, they sat together in the dim glow of the conference room, papers scattered, notes scribbled across a whiteboard. The air was warm with exhaustion and quiet pride. Alexander leaned back, studying the vision statement she'd just written. Compassion drives innovation. He smiled faintly, That's not exactly traditional corporate language. Emma laughed softly. Neither are we. He tilted his head. Watching her, do you ever miss what it was before all this? She thought for a moment. Sometimes, the simplicity of not knowing where things would go, the thrill of uncertainty. She paused. But then I remember what we've built now, and I wouldn't trade it for anything. He nodded, eyes soft. Neither would I. Outside, the city pulsed with its endless rhythm taxis, crosswalks, the low hum of life continuing. Inside, everything felt still, grounded. In the months that followed, Stonecarter Innovations became a name people spoke with warmth. Articles called it a company reborn from scandal into empathy. Competitors mocked it at first, calling compassion a weakness. But when Stonecarter's employee retention rates soared, when their new AI ethics platform won international acclaim, the tone changed. Even Richard Stone, watching from the quiet edges of exile, could not deny the success. For the first time, the empire he built no longer carried his signature, but it still bore his name. One afternoon, Emma received a small envelope with no return address. Inside was a single line in familiar handwriting. You were right about him. She didn't show it to Alexander. She didn't need to. Some truth belonged to silence. The company celebrated its first anniversary under the new name with a gathering by the Hudson. No suits, no speeches, just music, candles, and people who believed in what they had built. As the evening light dimmed, Alexander stood beside Emma, watching their team laughing, dancing, sharing stories under strings of golden bulbs. This, he said quietly, wasn't in any business plan. Emma smiled, her hand brushing his. No. But maybe this is what business was supposed to be all along. For a long moment, they stood there, saying nothing, just watching. The hum of conversation, the scent of the river, the glow of lights reflecting off her hair, it all felt perfectly imperfect. Alexander looked at her, a soft warmth in his eyes. You changed everything, he murmured. She shook her head gently. No, we did, because you let it change you first. He smiled then, not the polite one that used to hide behind professionalism, but the real one, the rare one, the kind that said he had finally come home to himself. Above them, the city shimmered alive, vast, and forgiving. And in that quiet moment by the river, where steel met water and old names met new dreams, the empire that once defined power found something greater. Grace. And from that grace, something even rarer began to grow, a legacy not of wealth or dominance, but of humanity. The kind of strength that could only come from the courage to be kind. The air that afternoon carried the quiet sweetness of early autumn. Leaves drifted across the road like forgotten notes of summer, golden and soft. The drive to Vermont felt slower this time, gentler, as if the world itself wanted them to take their time. Emma rested her head against the window, watching the trees blur into shades of amber and rust. Alexander drove in silence, one hand on the wheel, the other loosely holding hers. No words were needed. The rhythm of the road, the steady hum of the engine, said everything they couldn't. When they reached the edge of the forest, the same one where it had all begun, a strange calm washed over her. The cabin still stood there by the lake, framed by pine and sky, as if time had decided to wait for them. The water was perfectly still, a mirror, catching every ripple of light that danced through the clouds. Alexander parked and stepped out first. The wind carried the faint scent of wood smoke and pine. Emma followed, her shoes crunching softly over the gravel. The cabin door creaked the same way it had that first evening. Inside, dust motes spun in golden spirals through the slanted light. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had. He turned to her, his voice quiet. Do you remember that night? She smiled. I remember thinking I was walking into something I didn't understand. He looked at her for a long moment, the way he always did when he was searching for words big enough to hold what he felt. Then he simply said, You still are. They spent the afternoon there cooking together, laughing when the fire sputtered, sitting on the steps while the sun slipped lower through the trees. It wasn't the romance of luxury that surrounded them. It was the kind that felt simple, unguarded, real, the kind that doesn't need to announce itself. As the sun began to fall, painting the sky in orange and rose, Alexander grew quiet. Emma noticed his stillness, but said nothing. He stood and walked a few steps toward the water's edge. The lake caught the color of fire gold at the center, deepening to crimson near the shore. He turned back to her, something raw in his expression. "Emma," he said, almost as if testing the sound of her name. "I used to think I understood what strength meant, that it was control, perfection, winning." His voice softened, "But I was wrong. It's you. It's the way you see people, the way you see me even when I'm hiding." She didn't move, just watched him, her heart tightening with something she couldn't quite name. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Then, without hesitation, he knelt right there, in the fading light, the lake behind him, the air still as breath. "Emma Carter," he said, his voice trembling for the first time since she'd known him. "You are the most real thing in a world that keeps pretending. You make me want to be someone worthy of being seen. And if you'll let me, I want to spend the rest of my life trying to deserve that." He opened the box. Inside, a simple ring gold, with a small, brilliant diamond that caught the light like a drop of water. The wind stirred, brushing through the trees like an unseen hand. The world seemed to hold its breath. Emma felt her vision blur. It wasn't the ring that made her heart ache. It was the look in his eyes, open, unguarded, full of quiet hope. She knelt down too, her voice a whisper. "Alexander?" "Yes." The word barely left her lips before he smiled that rare, unpracticed smile that belonged only to her and slipped the ring onto her finger. The metal was cool against her skin, but his hand was warm, steady. For a moment, neither of them spoke. They just stayed there, kneeling together in the dying light, the lake shimmering beside them. A heron flew across the surface, its wings slicing through the reflection of the sky. The sound of it, slow, rhythmic, almost sacred, seemed to echo through the stillness. He reached up, cupping her face gently. "You're crying," he murmured. She laughed softly through the tears. "I'm not sure I'm supposed to stop." He leaned in, resting his forehead against hers. "Then don't." The first stars began to appear above the tree line, their reflections scattered across the lake. "A constellation in motion," Emma whispered. "It's strange, all the chaos, all the noise, and somehow we ended up right back here." Alexander nodded, his voice barely audible. Maybe this is where everything was always trying to lead us. They sat together on the dock, hand in hand, watching as night slowly folded over the sky. The world around them quieted, only the soft lapping of water and the distant call of an owl breaking the silence. He glanced down at her, his thumb brushing the edge of her new ring. "Do you ever think about how different we were back then?" She smiled faintly. "We still are." He chuckled, low and gentle. "And that doesn't scare you?" "No," she said, leaning against him. "Because difference isn't the problem. It's what makes the space where love can breathe." For a while, they said nothing more. The night deepened, cool air settling around them. Somewhere in the trees, a firefly blinked once, twice, then disappeared into the dark. Emma turned her head, looking at him, the man who had once seemed untouchable, unfeeling, almost unreal. And now, sitting beside her, he looked human in the most beautiful way. She reached out, tracing his hand with her fingertips. "What happens next?" He looked out across the lake, the reflection of the moon bright in his eyes. "Whatever we build," he said softly, "we build it together." The words lingered between them, warm and quiet. The lake shimmered beneath the moonlight, and somewhere deep inside her, Emma felt it, the stillness of belonging, Not to a place, not to a company, but to a person. And as they sat there, wrapped in silence and starlight, the future felt wide open calm, certain, and utterly real. The morning air was soft, carrying the scent of rain and magnolia through the open windows of their New England home. The world outside was quiet, the kind of stillness that comes when life finally settles into the rhythm it was meant to have. 2 years had passed since that evening by the lake, yet the memory of it still lived between them, like the gentle pulse beneath every shared glance. Emma stood in front of the mirror, one hand resting over the gentle curve of her belly. The child would arrive in spring. She smiled faintly, not the bright, uncertain smile of the woman who had once stood trembling in an elevator, but one softened by time and understanding. Behind her, Alexander adjusted his tie, catching her reflection with that same steady gaze that had once disarmed boardrooms and headlines alike. Only now, it held something else, peace. Downstairs, the house hummed quietly. A kettle whistled, the fireplace crackled. Outside, the first leaves of October drifted across the yard like slow-falling sparks. They didn't talk much that morning. They didn't need to. Today wasn't about words. It was about showing up together. Later, as they walked hand in hand across the Harvard campus, the afternoon light poured through the trees in long, golden threads. Students hurried past, laughing, carrying books, living lives not yet tested by the weight of choice. Emma smiled at them, remembering what it felt like to be that young, to believe success was something you earned only through strength. The auditorium was full. Cameras, notebooks, quiet anticipation. When she stepped onto the stage, a hush fell over the room. She didn't speak right away. She just looked out at the faces waiting, young, eager, uncertain, and thought about the woman she used to be. The one who wanted to prove she was enough. Her voice, when it came, was soft but sure. When I first stepped into the corporate world, she began, I thought success meant power control, recognition, respect. I believed love was something that got in the way of all that. She paused, her gaze finding Alexander in the front row. But sometimes life brings you someone who turns everything you thought you knew upside down. The audience leaned in. Success, she said gently, isn't about winning. It's about understanding yourself, others, what truly matters. It's about having the courage to love someone in a world that tells you not to, and loving them the right way, even when the world isn't watching. For a moment, the room was utterly still. Then came the sound of quiet applause, the kind that starts softly, then grows until it fills the air. Alexander didn't clap. He just looked at her, pride flickering in his eyes, the way sunlight flickers across water. When she left the stage, he stood waiting at the edge, reaching for her hand. No grand gestures, no cameras needed, just two people who had walked through fire and learned how to stand in the warmth that came after. Outside, the sky was turning the color of honey. The city buzzed beyond the gates, alive and restless. But here, in this pocket of calm, everything slowed. They walked down the path that led toward the Charles River, their steps unhurried. Leaves crunched beneath their shoes. The breeze carried the faint sound of bells from a nearby chapel. Emma stopped, watching the light dance across the water. "Do you ever think about him?" she asked softly. Alexander nodded once. "Every day? Does it still hurt?" He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Not the way it used to. I think he did what he knew, and I did what I needed to. Maybe forgiveness isn't about forgetting. Maybe it's just about letting the story end differently." She smiled, her eyes misting. "You've changed." He looked at her, his expression warm and calm. "No, you made me see who I always was." They stood there together, watching the river flow endless, steady, carrying both the past and the future within its current. The evening light deepened to gold, then to amber. A flock of geese passed overhead, their wings cutting through the quiet like a promise of movement, of seasons turning. Alexander reached for her hand again, his thumb tracing small circles against her skin. "You know," he murmured, "when I think about everything we've been through, I don't see chaos anymore. I see grace." Emma leaned her head against his shoulder. Maybe that's what healing looks like. They walked back slowly, the world around them softening into twilight. In the distance, the windows of their home glowed with warm light, a small, steady beacon against the fading sky. Inside, a framed photo rested on the mantel, the two of them standing before the lake, her hand in his, the water behind them, still and bright. Beneath it, a small inscription carved into the frame read, "Built from compassion." The fire crackled gently. The air carried the scent of cedar and rain. Somewhere upstairs, a room waited half-painted, half-ready, full of quiet expectation. Emma sat by the window for a while that night, watching the moon rise over the trees. Her hand rested over the life growing within her, a heartbeat she could not yet feel, but already loved completely. Behind her, Alexander approached, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders. He kissed the side of her head, whispering, "Come to bed. In a minute," she said, smiling. He nodded, lingering for a moment before leaving the room. The world outside shimmered faintly under the moonlight. The lake beyond their yard caught the reflection of the sky, the same way it had the night he asked her to stay, to believe, to begin again. She took a deep breath, the kind you take when the world feels right, even in its imperfection, and as she looked out at the still water, she realized something quiet and beautiful, that love, when it's real, doesn't rescue you from life. It teaches you how to live it. Downstairs, a clock chimed softly. Somewhere, a door closed, and in the silence that followed, Emma smiled a slow, peaceful smile as the night folded gently around her. The next morning, when sunlight spilled across the floor, two figures stepped out onto the porch. Their hands met easily, fingers intertwining like roots of the same tree. They walked toward the lake, the same one that had witnessed their first truth, their first fall, their first promise. The light touched them as they moved forward, side by side, no longer shadow and reflection, but one whole story. And in that golden glow, they disappeared into the brightness where love, finally, had nothing left to prove. Sometimes, life teaches us through the quietest moments, not through victory, but through vulnerability. This story reminds us that love is not a weakness, and compassion is not a flaw. True strength is found in those who dare to care, even when the world tells them not to. Alexander and Emma's journey shows that success built on fear and control will always crumble, but success built on understanding can last a lifetime. We all reach a point in life where we must choose between being right and being kind, between protecting our pride and opening our hearts. And it's in that choice that our humanity is revealed. For those of us who have lived long enough to see how fragile people can be, this story is a gentle reminder. Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It means freeing yourself to move forward. Love, at any age, is not about possession, but about presence, the quiet courage to stay, to listen, and to grow together. Because in the end, what remains isn't the power we held or the titles we earned, but the grace we gave and the hearts we touched along the way. Thank you, dear listeners, for spending your precious time with Shining Stories. If this story touched your heart or reminded you of something true about love, kindness, or forgiveness, please give it a like, share it with someone who needs a little light today, and subscribe to our channel for more heartfelt tales like this one. Your support means more than words. It helps us keep telling stories that remind us all of what really matters: compassion, hope, and the beauty of being human.